For most of human history, debt was something to be feared. Kingdoms fell because of it. Empires collapsed under its weight. Leaders who borrowed too much usually didn't last very long. And yet today, almost every country on Earth is buried under debt. And no one seems very worried about it. In fact, governments borrow more money every year. Economists calmly explain why it's manageable, and markets barely react. Trillions are added like it's just another line in a spreadsheet. So the obvious question is, if debt was once so dangerous, why does it suddenly seem harmless? To understand this, we need to rewind and ask a simple question. What is government debt, really? When a government spends more money than it collects in taxes, it fills the gap by borrowing. It issues bonds, basically IOUs, and promises to pay them back later with interest. These bonds are bought by banks, pension funds, insurance companies, foreign governments, and sometimes even the country's own central bank. On paper, it sounds responsible. Borrow now, pay later. The problem is that later keeps getting pushed further and further away. Decades ago, debt levels were relatively small. After World War II, many countries had high debt, but they also had fast economic growth, rising populations, and expanding industries. Over time, that growth made the debt easier to handle. The debt didn't disappear, but the economy grew around it. So governments learned a lesson. As long as the economy keeps growing, debt doesn't feel painful. And for a while that seemed true. But then something changed. Growth slowed. Populations aged. Productivity gains became harder. At the same time, governments promised more than ever before: healthcare, pensions, subsidies, stimulus programs, bailouts, and emergency spending whenever a crisis appeared. Instead of choosing between higher taxes or lower spending, most governments chose a third option: borrow more. So governments learned a lesson. As long as the economy keeps growing, debt doesn't feel painful. And for a while that seemed true. But then something changed. Growth slowed. Populations aged. Productivity gains became harder. At the same time, governments promised more than ever before: healthcare, pensions, subsidies, stimulus programs, bailouts, and emergency spending whenever a crisis appeared. Instead of choosing between higher taxes or lower spending, most governments chose a third option: borrow more. At first, this didn't seem dangerous either, because interest rates kept falling. Interest rates are the cost of borrowing money. When rates are high, debt is painful. When rates are low, debt feels cheap. And for the past few decades, interest rates around the world have been trending downward. Lower rates meant governments could borrow enormous amounts of money while paying very little to service that debt. Felt like a free lunch. Why raise taxes today when you can borrow cheaply and let the future deal with it? Slowly, debt stopped feeling like an emergency and started feeling like a policy tool. Then came the financial crisis. Then the pandemic. Then inflation shocks. Each time, governments borrowed on a scale that would have been unthinkable in the past. And each time, the system didn't collapse. This reinforced a dangerous belief. Maybe debt doesn't really matter anymore. Some economists even began to argue exactly that. As long as a country borrows in its own currency, they said, it can never truly run out of money. After all, it can always create more. And technically, that's true. But creating money to deal with debt comes with consequences. It doesn't make the debt vanish. It changes who pays for it. When governments rely on money creation and borrowing instead of taxes, the cost often shows up as inflation. Prices rise. Savings lose value. Wages struggle to keep up. The debt is still there, but it's quietly shifted onto ordinary. Governments aren't drowning in debt because they are careless. They're drowning because modern economies are built on promises that are hard to keep without borrowing. Aging populations, slower growth, political pressure to spend, financial systems addicted to cheap money. Debt is no longer a temporary solution. It's become the foundation. The real danger isn't that everything suddenly collapses tomorrow. The real danger is that debt slowly reshapes society. Lower growth, higher living costs, greater inequality, and fewer opportunities for the next generation. So when governments say debt is under control, they're not exactly lying. They've just redefined what control means. The debt isn't gone. The bill hasn't been paid. It's simply being rolled forward, quietly year after year, into a future that keeps getting closer. And whether that future feels manageable depends on how long the world can keep pretending this is fine.